reflect on the last several years, I'm actually just out of residency about 5 years, but I feel like it's been quite the roller coaster, up and down experiences over the last several years, a few curveballs. James mentioned that I did have a partner pass away suddenly, and he was my mentor. He was someone that had recruited me to this institution, and I was planning on having him around for a while in the future. And that came right on the heels of our other partner saying he was going to retire. So I find myself in this situation now where I'm responsible for the radiation oncology department in 2 different hospitals just a few years out from my training. And I suspect that's something that's not terribly uncommon in the country, because there are a number of smaller hospitals, community hospitals, freestanding practices where you might be in a situation like that for various reasons that staffing changes. So I appreciate the opportunity, and this is kind of a very sort of laid-back presentation. This is not going to be, you know, lots of journal articles, but it's more talking about my experiences, and I also want it to be an exchange of ideas and questions. And so we're trying something new we haven't done before, and that is I just projected a web address at the top of the screen where you're welcome to go, and then you can type questions, and then we can talk about those things if you want throughout this. You can go ahead and submit those throughout. We'll probably mainly keep the questions to the end. I can look at those partway through though if it comes up, and you can also thumbs up and thumbs down the other questions so you can see what it is would be interesting to talk about a little bit more. So I'll leave that there for just a minute in case you want to get your browser to that address and be able to type in something, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So to start out with, the basic idea of this presentation was just to talk about the how to be successful and happy in private practice. We called it of a freestanding private practice, but really the issue is a non-academic private practice. When you are in an academic institution, you're kind of in a, you know, all features are included in that. You have a support structure in terms of, you know, statistical analysis and grant and funding, and all of that is usually built into the hospital, as well as kind of an integrated system where all the referrals are automatic, and you have lots of you know, academic and professional support, and so that's all kind of built in. The question is really, if you're in private practice, you may have a wide variety of practice environments, from being an employed physician at a hospital to being a sole proprietor that owns your own equipment in the community, and those are the situations where you are really in a position of responsibility where you have to figure out how to solve the problems that come up on your own, whether that involves hiring other professionals who are experts at billing or management or EMRs or whatever the case may be. So this is more about non-academic private practices. So in terms of the key issues that we're going to talk about, on a general philosophic basis, we're going to be looking at key questions relevant to a new practitioner, which include, what do you want from your practice? And so this is kind of an existential thing. To be successful and to be happy in your private practice, you really need to have a good idea of where you're going, what you want, how you're going to find the team that is going to help you to get that thing. And then you need to ask some hard questions of yourself about what's really the bottom line. Are you looking for free time? Are you looking for autonomy so that you can make your practice decisions without a bureaucrat telling you that you have to do your documentation a certain way, or you have to do your ICD-9 or 10 codes in a certain way? Or is the bottom line just income, being able to retire and have that all taken care of quickly for you? And so how to be successful in your private practice is going to be unique to you. It's going to be distinct to the individual. What's success in my mind is going to be different than other people's success. So this is kind of an outline of some of the keys that I believe are crucial for meeting the challenges of private practice. Ask the right questions before committing to a practice. Once you're actually in a practice, you may have no control anymore over how to negotiate and manage some of these issues. So you need to ask these questions ahead of time. Now, most of the people on this call are obviously already in practice. That's okay. You may be looking for a change of pace. You may be looking for ways to have leverage so that you can still change your existing practice, or you may be looking for a new one. It's still important to recognize how to look ahead of time before you commit to a new practice. Bring your own interests and skills to the practice. So what I mean by that is, You may have a particular interest in doing procedures like brachytherapy or putting in fiducials yourself. You may have a particular interest in a particular organ system. So those things are going to be important for your satisfaction and quality of life in the practice, and you're going to probably need to ask other people in the department to make changes so that they can accommodate the particular skill set that you're bringing, and so that's an important skill to have to be happy in your practice. Outreach to grow the business. That's an important part of private practice that may not be as important in an academic institution. If you're in an integrated health system, you may never have to worry about referrals. It may be automatic for you, but many people are in a competitive environment, and it is crucial to make sure that you build trusting relationships in the community in order to be successful. Diplomacy and a multidisciplinary team. I feel like this is crucial no matter where you're at, obviously. If you're in tumor boards and there's an issue on the table, you need to be able to manage those issues while keeping friends. You need to make sure that no one's offended by your comments and that you're able to navigate. If someone says something that's completely off base, you need to be able to address that without making them feel personally insulted or taking offense in the way that you discuss those issues. And just for the record, I'm going to be discussing some personal experiences with these things that are not always personally flattering of myself. So I'll give you some of my successes and also some of my failures on some of these things over the years. Next, we're going to talk about bringing up the quality. Practice improvement is very important for success and being able to have a successful private practice. Meeting regulatory requirements is a huge issue. It's a big challenge because they're constantly changing. You've got HIPAA, you've got MACRA, you've got meaningful use. Every year you've got another acronym that's coming at you, demanding that you spend time to figure out exactly what's involved and how you're going to be heard if you don't comply. And that's probably never going to change. So you need to be able to meet those issues, and you need to know whether you're going to be responsible for that or whether you're going to hire staff people who are going to be responsible for that, and that's important. And then finally, tend to the business end of things. Every physician needs to make a decision about how much you want to do medical care and how much you want to do things other than medical care. So you can have a practice in which you are integrated in the secretarial work, the hiring, the accounting, a lot of things that are not medical. That may be very rewarding for you, and it may be financially better than actually just practicing medicine. That may not be your cup of tea, and so you need to recognize that that is part of what you need to look at when you are deciding on a practice. But more importantly, no matter what practice you end up in, you need to be cognizant of these issues, because otherwise you could be at a real disadvantage. And that again is an example where I'm going to tell you some stories of ways that I found out we were losing tens of thousands of dollars a year because no one had really looked at the business end of things in quite a while in my department. And when we finally looked at it, we found some ways that things could be optimized. So first up, ask the right questions before committing to a practice. First of all, let me tell you about my practice and the way that I ended up here. I did residency in Buffalo, New York at Roswell Park Cancer Institute, and when I started looking for a job, I found that I had immediately some opportunities from people that I knew through the American Medical Association. I had done med school in Iowa, and when I went to an AMA Iowa kind of a reunion dinner, several people said, hey, we're looking for a radiation oncologist in our community. We'd love to have you back in Iowa. And I thought they were just being polite, but then I got a phone call the next week from one of them who said, no, it was from a radiation oncologist who said, this other physician told me you may be looking in for a job and I'd love to talk with you. So that opened the door for me to take a trip out to the state, and I visited 3 or 4 different practices while I was looking, and I found that they were all very different. One was an academic institution. One was in a small community in northern Iowa that was a hospital practice that had been contracting the physicians for the professional services, but had just made an agreement with that group to now employ the physicians, and basically was offering a 20% increase in their reimbursement, even though they were going to be doing the same amount of work. So they were basically giving them incentive to become hospital employees. And then another practice that included a multi-physician group that included every specialty, basically 180 physicians covering several communities over central Iowa. And the nice thing about that practice was it was shareholder based, so it was a physician-owned practice, and there was some self-governance. The physicians actually had some autonomy and some responsibility, but you still had a lot of support because it had an administration and professionals who were leading this 180 physician organization. It was not a fly-by-night operation. It was very professionally run with IT professionals, other people to make sure we had compliance and that sort of thing with HIPAA, and et cetera, et cetera. So as I was looking at these different practices, I decided, key for me was the autonomy issue. I want to be able to have the flexibility to add parts to my practice, to do procedures, to add equipment, to make decisions about people that I want to work with. I ended up getting offers from these different institutions. The offer for the small community hospital in the north was $500,000 straight out of residency, base salary, and they were going to pay us student loans up to $150,000 and give a $50,000 bonus. So that one was clearly the winner in terms of money, but the community was smaller, and I would have been an employed physician, and it sounded fishy to me. I was wondering why were they so desperate to get someone in there. And then the second practice had a guarantee of $350,000, and then on top of that, if my production was greater than $350,000, it would be based on production. And so I ended up choosing the second option there, and that's where I practice now, and that is at McFarland Clinic. And this is the hospital where I practice. It's called Mary Greeley Medical Center in Ames. I also practice at a satellite institution that's about an hour drive away, and we provide the services of both of those hospitals, the professional services only, but the department is actually hospital-based. So the other employees in the department are not my employees. They are employees of the hospital, which limits in some regards my autonomy. I can't make hiring decisions about them. But the crucial thing for me in making this decision was that Mary Greeley Hospital has a very long-standing collegial relationship with McFarland Clinic, the group of physicians that is connected to the hospital. And so even though they're separate institutions, they're run as if they're one institution, and it's just a very, very tight-knit community and group of physicians. And that's worked out really well. Over the last few years there's been lots of drama, but one thing that's been consistent is our department has had very high quality. Within the hospital, we have the highest patient satisfaction numbers in the hospital, and then the physician group started an ACO with our largest insurer in the state, Wellmark Blue Cross Blue Shield, and that organization actually showed that there was the highest quality in the state and the highest value among all the ACOs. There was about a dozen ACOs at the time. And so I feel like this was a great institution. That's how I decided on this. And I think that that decision, even though I lost hundreds of thousands of dollars the first year and probably hundreds of thousands of dollars every year since then, that decision has been the most important thing in terms of making me happy and making sure that my practice has been a successful one. So you have to ask yourself these hard questions. Do you want to be an employed physician? And this is not, there's no right answer here. If you're comfortable having someone else give you marching orders and knowing that all you have to do is show up for a very set amount of time and clock in, clock out, and do the responsibilities that you're intended to do, that may be perfect for you. And then you don't have the responsibility, you don't have sort of the angst of, we just had giant cuts to the technical reimbursement. Now how are we going to pay for the linear accelerator that we've got out on loan or whatever? What is the hierarchical structure of the practice? If you have senior partners who have a stranglehold on the governance of your organization, that's important to know. How much are you really going to be able to influence that organization? You're going to be a minority voice for years to come, and you may actually never have sort of an equal footing with them. There are a lot of practices who hire people for a couple years and then they say, I'm sorry, it didn't work out. We're not going to renew your contract. And that's a terrible situation, and people feel taken advantage of in a situation like that. Then, as I mentioned before, you have to decide how much time is going to be spent in medical practice and how much flexibility do you want to pursue other interests. So people in academics want to be able to write their papers, but people in private practice still want to be involved in committees. I certainly have been very involved in organized medicine. I go to ACRO meetings, ASTRO meetings, AMA meetings, and that takes time. away from my practice, and I have to have the support of my partners in order to do that. And then administrative issues. So what kind of administrative support do you have, and do you want to be as involved in the business of the practice as you need to be? And then of course personal time. It's worth it to me to be able to take vacations and conference time, even though that affects my bottom line and my reimbursement is less because of it. Because I have flexibility, I can take off an enormous amount of time in my current practice, and that's what I value. Okay, so I basically just talked about this. Recognize that the best practice is probably not a perfect practice. You're going to have to find the best combination of circumstances and then go for it. Okay, so some examples. Bring your own interests and skills to the practice. This is the second bullet point that I had in that initial things that we wanted to cover. When I came here, they were doing stereotactic radiosurgery for brain metastases, but they hadn't really started doing any SBRT for lung or anything else. They weren't really doing image guidance for prostate. No one was putting in fiducials, and that was important to me. And then in the last couple years, we've also added Optune for GBM patients. I've started doing space-OR injections. I do those myself. If you're not familiar, that's the hydrogel that gets injected between the rectum and the prostate that helps with the DVH. It really just makes rectal toxicity non-existent. And so those are new programs that I came here and I was like, this is something I want to do. It's something that's important to me and I would like to get started. As previously mentioned, I'm not employed by the department where I practice at either hospital. I just contract for the professional services. So I then have to basically get buy-in from the administration and from the department supervisor and from the director of radiology or whatever the director is in your hospital to support the equipment purchases and the changes in the infrastructure of the way the department runs to be able to do these PET projects. Now that's kind of a hassle, and that takes extra time away from just seeing patients, and no one pays you for that effort. And so you have to sort of decide, is this something that I'm going to find professionally satisfying enough and important enough for my patients that it's worthwhile? Because it is important, and I mean I find it extremely rewarding, and I'm proud when I am able to sit down with a patient and have a prostate conversation and talk to them about, yes, we do HDR brachytherapy here. I started the program 2 years ago with some urologists here at the hospital, and we do this space-OR gel and fiducials. We started that program a few years ago, and I'm the only guy in the state of Iowa that does the space-OR gel. You know, that's a nice differentiator competitively. But I also know that that's the kind of care I would want if I were going to a provider, to have all of those options available to me, and so that gives me some pride in my private practice to be able to offer those. So before I go on to a couple more examples on that, I just want to go to the second bullet point that says don't underestimate the influence of techs and secretaries in your department's overall success and happiness. When I started the fiducial program in our department, we purchased an ultrasound machine, we got all of the equipment, we went through, figured out exactly what we needed to do in terms of doing the orders and everything. But then the challenge was, I've got radiation techs in the department and nurses who have been here for longer than I've been alive. And they do not like to be told that they're going to do things differently than they want to do them. And there's also a set of people in the department who don't like blood, who don't like needles. They're like, this is a radiation department. What are we doing with sharp objects here? How can this be? And so, so I had to sort of win them over and talk to them about how this is going to be helpful, it's going to be advantage. And it's been an ongoing issue. I feel like I'm still battling these things. Optune, for example, that's the newest one. Optune is, you know, the transducer array for GBM patients that has increased the median overall survival for GBM patients, and I'm a believer. You know, I think that there was some really good data there. So I'm trying to convince my nurses that this is a good thing to offer, and they say, oh, that sounds like such a hassle. No one's going to want to do that. So I still struggle with this, even though I feel like I've won their trust over the last several years. After we finally got the fiducial program set up, the therapists were the biggest advocates with the patients when the patients were like, I don't know if I want to have these gold things put into my prostate. They say, oh, it is so much better. You're going to be so glad you did it because it just makes things so accurate and so fast, and it's totally worth it. And so they went from being the biggest skeptics to the biggest advocates. And you have to sell some of your ideas to the secretaries and a lot of people who you wouldn't necessarily think are decision makers in the department in order to be successful. And so people have an investment in the department even if they're not actually the people technically you have to convince in order to get something started. So just as far as a case to start a new program or offer, I just told you about kind of when we did the fiducials, but there's been several others. Mammocyte, Savvy, those are all challenges that when we went to start that, the medical oncologists really had their objections because before I got here there had been some brachytherapy, partial breast irradiation that had not gone well, and then you know, I had to say, look, we're going to use the dosimetric planning parameters that are shown to be successful and less toxic, which was not done before, and that's also hard to do because you don't want to throw your partners under the bus, and you don't want to you have to be diplomatic in the way that you do this, but then you're trying to also start this new program and get everyone on board. And so it's a process. Everyone from the secretary to the referring providers need to be sort of brought in as you're bringing those new offerings online, and that's key. Okay, so next up, I just want to talk about outreach to grow the business. So here's where it's going to be very different depending on what kind of practice you're in. If you are happy to just have your little niche of the market and you just want to, you know, keep it and give high quality care, that's fantastic. In that situation, all you got to do is make sure that you don't burn bridges with your existing referring providers. But typically, you can't really just do that. You have to make sure that you got your competitive edge so that if another radiation oncology program builds a center across the street that has protons or whatever new, you know, bell and whistle marketing gem that's available at the moment, that you're not going to lose all of your business. So you have to always be a little bit conscious about outreach. And here I'm defining outreach as outreach to referring providers. Clearly marketing to patients is a whole different issue. So I have some stories in this particular regard. How will you handle the competition? How are you going to be able to keep in business? How are you going to manage being you know, potentially a smaller practice compared with academic centers or large urban centers? So here's my experience. You know, I'm in a community that's 45 minutes north of Des Moines where there's some very large radiation centers, and we essentially you know, catch this watershed that's north of Des Moines that includes several small communities. There was a small community in Marshalltown that wanted a certificate of need. This is about an hour to the east of us, and we decided that we needed to make sure that we didn't make them angry because they provide about 1/3 of our patients to our existing center, and we found that they were really angry about the fact that they were not able to have a cancer center there locally. And if we had said, well, we're not going to provide that because that would be cannibalizing our own patients, that would have really burned some bridges with the referring providers in that community. So when they provided, or they applied for their certificate of need with the state, we sided with them and said we would provide the professional services for them, even though it was probably against our own best business interests to do that, but we decided that was important. We also, in the other direction with Fort Dodge, we said that we would move our linear accelerator down the street to a new cancer center, and so we try to basically support the local communities and show our support there because it helps the primary care providers in those communities have confidence in us and feel like we're on the same team rather than a competing health entity, because technically we are a competing entity. My practice is a separate organization than the largest system in the state. And we do find that we're in competition, and so it's important to make sure that you foster those relationships. I know that the University of Iowa is a few hours away, and they're a tertiary care center. Mayo is a few hours away from me. They're obviously world-renowned, and so the radiation oncologists at those hospitals respect me. Many of them know me personally, and so when they get a patient from my community who's been referred there by a surgeon or some other specialist, they see the radiation oncologist and then they get referred straight back. So that is key to keeping your business, your reputation, and making sure that you're getting those patients back, is to foster those relationships with those tertiary care centers and make sure that you're not making people angry with that. So that's kind of my experience on that issue. The other issue is one of the hospitals that I go to really wants to expand their reach, and so they've asked me as the director to go meet with the referring providers and make sure that they understand what we're doing and what services we provide, and that they're happy with the way that we're communicating with them, with our documentation, etc. So we have lunches on a regular basis with referring providers, and I've driven all over the state to meet with them personally as well. And that takes time from your clinical practice, but it is an opportunity for you to meet people face-to-face that otherwise you may never meet, but you may share patients with, and make sure that they feel comfortable with what you've done, and they'll remember you from that, and that may make the difference in getting referrals or not. So that's another sort of strategy for outreach. Next issue, diplomacy in a multidisciplinary team. And I think that this, I bet everyone has stories about, you know, how they've been able to do this, but coming straight out of residency, you have a lot of knowledge, you have a lot of fire in your belly to get out there and make sure the patients are being treated right. You come into a small community hospital that doesn't have all of the bells and whistles of a larger academic institution where you trained, and you realize that things may not always be up to your level of, you know, what you would prefer in terms of quality. Maybe you're not getting those surgical evaluation of mediastinal lymph nodes for lung patients. Maybe you're not getting appropriate or, you know, complete pathology reports to say every scrap of information. Maybe you have referring providers or others in your tumor boards that you feel like are not practicing correctly. Well, this is a challenge, and you have to find a way to manage from an equal level with these other providers and make sure that you recognize that you have to respect them. Unfortunately, as a specialty, I think radiation oncology doesn't get a lot of respect. I think that everyone knows that we are 100% referral based, and we don't provide referrals to anyone else. Essentially, we just are on the receiving end of that, and so they take every opportunity to walk on us, it seems like at times. But you need to make sure that they know that you're professional and that you can help provide them with things that will help make their work easier. If you can provide them papers and information in a way that is diplomatic and not charged, that's going to be really helpful. So this is one of those times where I do have actually many stories, and so I don't think I have time to tell you very many of them, and I don't even know if I want to tell you very many of them, but there's a couple in particular that stand out. When I started my practice here, I went to tumor boards, and I noticed that we were really not seeing very many post-prostatectomy patients until their PSA had risen way too high. So when we had a patient discussed at our tumor boards whose PSA had already risen into the stratosphere and had never been referred for salvage radiation until it was essentially way too late, I tried to diplomatically bring up that, you know, recommendations from the AUA and ASTRO say that you should involve a radiation oncologist for a discussion of salvage radiation whenever, you know, those criteria are met in that paper, in that recommendation. When I brought this up, one urologist in particular was just completely offended, and he made a point to come to my department afterward, and he said, yes, you always quote these papers and the data says this, but I've been in practice for many decades and I've seen thousands of patients and I know better than that. Basically, he said, you know, his experience tells him that those things are not true. And of course, my jaw hits the floor, and I don't know how to respond to someone who doesn't understand evidence-based medicine and would rather put their own anecdotal experiences ahead of that. But I continue to try to be as diplomatic as possible. As I said, why don't we just compromise and go by the NCCN guidelines? Here's an objective guideline, and if you don't mind referring patients to me for a discussion, and if you disagree that they shouldn't get radiation at that time and I think they should, we can both present the information as per the guidelines, and then the patient can make a decision, and I'm happy to support if they choose not to have radiation at that point. And so I think that that worked, and I found that to be a successful strategy to an extent, but to be honest, ultimately it was not until that physician retired that we got some replacement urologists that we truly got the appropriate referrals. And so, you know, I was going to be successful. You win some, you lose some. And indeed, when I had a similar conversation with a medical oncologist, and I said, why don't we just go by the NCCN guidelines, he became so offended that he hung up on me. And later I talked to him and I said, I wasn't, saying you're not practicing appropriately. I just said, I intended to say, I would like to see the patients who the NCCN guidelines say radiation is an option for. And that's a general statement for every referring provider and for all situations, nothing about the way you were handling a specific patient. But he had interpreted what I was saying as saying that he was not treating the patient correctly, had not referred the patient correctly, was not following guidelines, and was harming this patient, which of course I would never say, but that's the way he heard it. And so it's really a matter of being able to navigate the personalities, and that's just life. So obviously everyone has their own stories, everyone's going to come up with their own situations like that. Next up is bring up the quality with ongoing practice improvement. So there's a maintenance of certification requirement to do practice improvement projects. And of course, even if it weren't, that's still a good idea. One way you can do practice improvement is accreditation. There are lots of different accreditation bodies. And indeed, the challenge for our department, the one that I've done since I became here, is I thought it would be important for us to get accredited. We did get ACRO accreditation. So I will tell you, this is going to be my plug for ACRO accreditation, and my conflict of interest is that I'm on the board with ACRO, but I genuinely believe that ACRO accreditation is a great benefit to practices. It's affordable compared with ACR and ASTRO, and it is the only accreditation program that has been certified by an outside body to be according to appropriate standards. And so I think it has a competitive edge compared to other accreditation programs. But of course, department accreditation is only one part of this. You also have breast center accreditation, Commission on Cancer accreditation, and we've gone through all these accreditation processes, all three of those at my institution since I've been here, and we have been successfully accredited in 2 out of the 3 of those. The third one is on the way. We're on probation on that. And at my second hospital, we've also been accredited. So this is a nice competitive thing, because then you can advertise it and you can show that you're an accredited breast center, for example. We were doing all the right things with the breast patients already, but we had patients saying, I'm going to go to Des Moines, or I'm going to go to this larger center, this academic center, because they're accredited. And you would say to them, we have all the same, we have all of the appropriate tools, and we do things the same way. But there is something very simple to be able to say we're accredited, that patients understand, and that they trust. And so that's something worthwhile. That's something worth considering doing. Next up, meet regulatory requirements. So here you have an example of HIPAA, MACRA, meaningful use. This is where things can get really hairy really fast. Now, if you're a sole proprietor radiation oncologist, first of all, I don't think there are many of those, and there certainly aren't very many of those straight out of residency, if any. But this is where you have to figure out how are you going to comply with these complex federal requirements or state requirements as a physician. This is esoteric stuff. You have to go to conferences on this. You have to hire staff on this. And so the typical thing that happens is you hire staff. They take care of these things. But then my second sub-bullet point on there, if you let others manage it, you may not like what you get. And that is exactly what has happened to me since I've been here. I spend so many hours in meetings with our EMR steering committee because they are constantly trying to put new restrictions on our use of the electronic medical record and our email and our computers that hamper my ability to get things done. Just to give this webinar, I had to make phone calls to the IT people and be like, I can't change the orientation of my screen. I can't install this software. And it drives me crazy because they have these security protocols in place to basically protect us from those physicians who will click any random link that comes into their email and install ransomware on their system, which causes the whole organization to, come to its knees. So obviously that's not me, but they don't know that. So it's a mixed bag. If you let others manage it, you lose some of your autonomy, and you may not like what you get. So with MACRA, I don't know if everyone knows what that is, but that's basically the regulatory requirement that replaced the SGR, and it's going to come with alternative payment models, and it's in the process of being determined. There's probably going to be payment bundling with other oncology services. That's a huge issue. If you're going to get payment bundling and the medical oncologists are going to be the leader of the team and decide how much you get paid or which patients you get to see, you want to know that ahead of time. So this is a way to get involved and try to sort of navigate how much you should be involved and how much you should have other professionals and administrative staff people involved so that you don't have to be an expert on every single thing. And that's one reason why I like the AMA. I like it kind of a hobby level, but there's a lot of stuff about it I don't get, and so I do participate in other ways. So the case that I was going to share is the one that I already did, being on the EMR steering committee. You know, they're constantly changing, for example, the log out time on computers. You walk away from a computer, it's going to log out automatically after like 5 minutes. And, you know, I would go to the meeting and be like, no, it should be 30 minutes, or it should be 15 minutes, or it should only be that long if it's in a public space, and if it's in my office, it should be 3 hours. And it takes someone pushing back in order to sort of, you know, preserve some rights. Now, you know, they say, and you may say, that's no big deal. Just log in again. It's not that big of a deal. But I feel like I log in 100 times a day, and if it's every day, that's a lot of time, and that's a lot of productivity that gets swallowed up. And that's just one issue. You know, how frequently passwords need to be changed. And then every time I change the password every 3 months on 12 different pieces of software, I have to type it in 4 times the next day because I can't remember that I changed it. So, you know, mobile device management policies, is that necessary? Do we need to have things locked down in that level? Whether we can install software on our own PCs. So those are all issues that I actively fight for by being on a committee and taking an interest in some of the administrative issues in my private practice. A lot of people are not interested at all in doing that, and that is up to you. Your mileage may vary. All right, so tending to the business end of things. I think that here is where there's a lot of variety in the way that people approach these things. You have people who have their own radiation oncology practice, own their equipment, hire all of the people in the department, and then take the responsibility for the staffing and all of the administration. The advantage of doing that is you can make $1 bajillion. I know people who have done quite well, and I know people who have started their own cancer center and hired medical oncologists as staff, and the radiation oncologist is the owner of the practice. That's fantastic, and that is lucrative. And it's also far removed from the practice of medicine. At least a lot of it is. And a lot of the time that you spend in that situation is. And so that's what some people want. Now there are other people, and I would be one of them, who are in a practice where most of the administrative stuff is handled by someone else. That is fine with me. But what I found is, in a 180 physician practice like mine, covering several communities, no one cares about radiation oncology except the radiation oncologist. So then you have to be an advocate for your own interest within the organization. And so you have to know a little bit about what your productivity is. You have to know a little bit about the finances of your department. You have to look into these things. That helps so that you can actually have some leverage when it comes to time to negotiate contracts, or if you want to ask for a new linear accelerator or a new person on staff or whatever the case may be. You know what your bargaining power is because you know what you are valued at to the organization or to the hospital where you contract your services. And so this is where the business end of things can be. You can get a Master's of Business Administration and start your own practice, or you can take an interest and take an administrative position or a leadership position in a different kind of a practice situation. So for me, as far as the business angle goes, I think I mentioned before that we were losing tens of thousands of dollars with charges, and no one had really looked at it in a long period of time. When I look at our balance book, so I'm going to show you here, this is actually what we call cost accounting. I actually just got an email today for the month of September 2016. This is the one I created the slide prior to today. So this is for August 2016, and I've covered up all of the actual financial amounts. What we see here is this balance sheet that has all sorts of generic terms that are not carefully explained here, and this is all that we're given unless you actually go ask for details. So what exactly does this mean when it says miscellaneous income? Like where is that coming from? What is occupancy expense when I'm in the hospital and my practice doesn't actually have to pay for that? What are we talking about when we talk about telephone and transcription services when I never use those transcription services? So this is a situation where I went to our chief financial officer of our organization. I sat down with this and I said, I want to understand all of this. Can you go over this with me? And he was more than willing to go over it with me. And he spent a lot of time explaining these things to me. And in the process of that conversation, we found that we had been paying for certain development of the electronic medical record that we didn't use. We used the hospital's electronic medical record, not the physician clinic electronic medical record. And so I was able to make the case that we shouldn't be paying for that. We not only didn't use it, we didn't even have access to it. And that's the one that was tens of thousands of dollars over several years that no one had even bothered looking at. And so it was simply just a matter of paying attention saved us a lot of money. Now, that was last year, and I had been in practice for 4 years, so it wasn't until I became the director of our department that I started looking at these things. Pagers. I had one partner who still was paying for a pager as recently as last year. We quit using pagers 5 years ago, like when I started here, and we were still paying for them, and it doesn't make any sense, and just no one had bothered looking at it. And I tell you, if I don't look at it as a radiation oncologist and a director of my own department, no one else in the hospital cares if they're overcharging us. So, I mean, obviously this is something where you could be critical of the previous medical director in my department, but what can I say? It's just something that they weren't particularly interested in. It wasn't a high value prospect to them to spend a lot of time looking over the business aspects of the department, and so they didn't do it. And so it's something that I think you have a responsibility to take an interest in, even if it's not something you are personally interested in, just as a matter of basic personal responsibility. Next thing, actually before I go on to dealing with being understaffed, let me also just mention we decided to hire from the production of our own department a billing and coding professional service that looks through all of our documentation and gives us feedback on how we do that. That was always done automatically as a resident, but when I came to this organization, there were lots of codes going in and there was no documentation to support it, and there were other things that we weren't even putting the codes in for. It was a mess. And so it was definitely the smart business thing to do to hire an outside organization to get things into shape. Now there are tons of organizations that do this. If you go to one of the large meetings, either ACRO or ASTRO, and go onto the floor where all the vendors are, you'll find many organizations that want to go ahead and get your administration streamlined. So you pay a fee for that. The one that we decided to use was someone that we knew, one of my partners knew from a previous practice, and so it was someone that we had confidence in, and that made me feel a lot better, and I do feel like it's paid for itself. It's like getting a financial advisor. Some people say it's a waste of money, other people say it pays for itself because you're getting a tax advantage and you know that your money's being managed the best way possible. How you decide to do it is up to you. If you feel very confident in your coding ability and keeping on top of those issues, then you probably don't need that, and our department is definitely worthwhile. All right, so now onto this slide that we're looking at now, challenge with being understaffed. So the biggest challenge here is that we have 3 physicians here to cover 2 hospitals so that someone can be off at any given time and we can still fulfill the supervision requirement of Medicare. When I had a partner die and another partner retire, we were no longer able to meet those needs unless we hired locums physicians. And because we're in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, no one wants to do locums for us unless we pay them $2,000 a day, which is, as you can imagine, way more than I typically make on a day because of the patient loads and that sort of thing. And so, it's extremely frustrating to have a locums physician come in who may or may not actually contribute to the addressing the workload. A lot of times they just babysit so that the hospital can build the technical component. And so I took this as an issue and I said, look, can we meet the supervision requirement with non-radiation oncologists or even non-physician providers? And I found that I got widely different information depending on who I asked. I asked ASTRO, I asked our billing specialists. I had been to talks at annual meetings where I'd gotten disparate information. And ultimately, I went to the Medicare website itself, the DHS website. I found the specific language in the requirement. I went to our credentialing committee. I went to our state board to see what exactly the scope of practice is for physicians who are not radiation oncologists, whether they could be included in that. And you find a solution, and you make sure that you keep a paper trail so that you have supporting documentation for all the decisions that you make. And then we were in fact able to find a way that we could have certain holidays staffed or supervised by non-radiation oncologists. Now we prefer and have had locums coverage most of the time, but that's not always possible, and it's certainly not financially the best thing to do. And so your mileage may vary, but again, this is a situation in which there's a challenge there, and no one is going to solve that problem for you, or if they do, may not be as effective. I mean, the easiest thing to do is just pay for locums, right? The administrator doesn't care. They'll pay for locums and just take it right out of your own production. So that means it's essentially coming from your own salary to pay someone else. And that could be a serious hit on your quality of life and your professional satisfaction. And so if you can come up with some alternative solutions, that may be to your advantage. All right. So I got a couple conclusions here, and then we'll go see if anyone has written any questions. As far as finances go, the reasonable thing is to take an interest and make an effort to optimize the business aspects you control while understanding the aspects you can't control. And so that's it. I mean, if you decide you want to be in control, go for it. If you decide that you're not in complete control, like I am in my situation, at least you can go in and understand it, and then as I did, go to the compensation committee of my organization and say we shouldn't be paying for these group services that we don't use. And even in that case, it was somewhat controversial, but we were able to advocate for ourselves and save ourselves a fair amount of money by just taking an interest in and taking responsibility for this private practice. The next conclusion is for staff and schedule. No radiation oncology is an island. You definitely need coverage, and you need a team. Working with quality people is going to be a huge driver of job satisfaction. Find people who share your values. If you find coworkers and staff members in a department that you're comfortable in, then they're going to be open to new modalities, to changes, to positive movement in terms of accreditation, whatever the case may be. And I'm really pleased with the practice that I found, but unfortunately I still have to recruit. I've had to recruit multiple partners. And so, you know, it's a satisfying situation, and that's just, who knows what the next curveball is going to be for me. And I think that is about it. So the last slide I have here is just know your values and have partners who share your values. So in my practice, we're not the highest paying practice in the state by far, but I think we're pretty close to the national average in terms of income. So what do you get for that? I get more vacation time. That's important to me. I get conference time so I can go to meetings and do the things that I want to do. I can take vacation and spend time with my family. That's how I've set up my practice, and I've hired partners who say things the same way. So this is not that these are the right values. These are my values, and they're my partner's values, and they match. And so there's no you know, disturbed expectations. Everyone understands what it's going to be, and in our practice, at least, the work that you do is what you get paid for. We're not on a salary basis where everyone splits everything up. It's if you're more busy, you get paid more, but we also equally split the consultations that come in to make sure that everyone is equal. And it works really well, and we're very happy with each other. It's not like we have fights about that, like I know some people do in some practices. So that's worked well. Now, the other part of your values that you need to know is how much you like to do things that are not medical care. This last week I was chatting with my wife, and we were joking around because, you know, I you know, don't like it when other people do stuff for me and I pay them. So that's mow the lawn, you know, clear the driveway. If someone comes in to clean our house or something like that, I'm almost critical. I feel like I'm overpaying and they didn't do it the right way. But I also don't want to do that myself, and I feel like my time is better spent doing other things, and so you have to recognize that. It's the same thing in radiation oncology. Do you want to be the person who's doing all the hiring interviews? Do you want to be the person who's doing a lot of administrative stuff? Do you want to type your notes instead of transcribe your notes, or are you willing to pay for those things or pay for other people to do those things? So that is basically a wrap on this. I'm going to go ahead back to the slide that pops up there. Any questions that you might have, you can go to this and type them in. And I'll wait just a moment in case anyone has any, but that is a wrap.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Hopkins. Like he said, if everyone could go to that URL to ask him any questions you'd like, and I will go navigate there too. It looks like someone submitted a question through the Citrix webinar format. So I'll just go ahead and read this out loud. Who do you hire for radiation oncology for coverage, nurse practitioner or medical oncologist?
So the answer is basically both. So when we initially did this, we were getting locums every chance we could, but there were a couple times when we just could not get a locums person to cover. So Christmas Eve, as you can imagine, every locums person in the country is busy on Christmas Eve if they're willing to be busy, and there's just no, it's just a time when everybody wants locums. During ASTRO or during spring break or whatever, you're going to have a really hard time getting locums. And so for those occasions, we needed some other way to do the supervision. The way we did it is we had a nurse practitioner that I knew. She was willing to come work in our department, and she was willing to, this was when we were understaffed in general. She was seeing follow-up visits for me. Obviously she couldn't do consults. She didn't have any radiation oncology specific training, but I got her credentialed at our hospital to do follow-ups for us and also to supervise radiation treatments. Now, because she didn't have any training, I also created a curriculum for her. Basically, she had to read a chapter from like the introduction of Perez. I can't remember what we had to read, but she had to basically bone up a little bit on what radiation oncology is, what it's all about. And then I sat down and went through a bunch of port films with her and showed her how to do some of these things. So, so she got credentialed through the hospital and then covered for us for those occasions. Now, it turns out I actually just had a partner in the last few weeks give her notice for resignation because she's got some family issues for which she needs to move to a different state. And so unfortunately we're now recruiting again. And now I'm looking at all the vacation I was going to take next year that I won't have coverage for, and we'll have to go back to a locums thing. And so just today I was firing off emails to radiologists at my one hospital and medical oncologists at the other hospital to see if they would be willing to cover. Now locums costs us $2,000 a day. What we decided to do is pay $500 a day for them to do supervision of our radiation treatments, and there will not be a radiation oncologist in the hospital. Now I'm getting a little bit into an area here where I have a feeling that different people will have very strong feelings in opposition to this or in support of this, but this is what we're looking at here to see if we can come up with a way to make this a little bit more reasonable. That's what we're doing. I do have a few questions that have shown up here on the Google Slides thing. You can probably see those as well. And I'll just go down through these. The first one is, how is your department rated separately from the hospital? We have customer satisfaction surveys that come in through the hospital for our department, and so that's where I was saying our department within the hospital has the highest customer satisfaction in the hospital, but then the McFarland Clinic organization is the physician group that is my direct employer, and they are an ACO. So as an accountable care organization that works with Walmart Blue Cross Blue Shield, they get quality metrics. That's not for me, that's really for the primary care providers in my organization, but that tells me that we have among the highest quality in the state and among the highest value in the state. I think we actually technically have the second highest quality and the highest value in terms of the cost, and so that was useful. Okay, how many clinic days a week does a typical private practice radiation oncologist work per week? So I don't know. Quite honestly, that's something that probably I could find on, like, I used to be on the ASTRO workforce committee, and we could look that up, but I think most people work 5 days a week because they're required for these supervision requirements. Now, the nice thing is if you're in a private practice, let's say you're in a smaller community, if you're done by noon, your supervision is done, then you get the second half of the day off. You know, maybe you work 5 half days a week. Obviously, that's going to come with a relatively lower compensation that is going to match that. But if you want to be part-time, that's great. You know, you can do that. And maybe you can find someone in a neighboring community and you can cover each other's clinics, so you can take whole weeks off or something like that. So you just have to come up with an option that works for you, creatively address the problems within the parameters of your practice location and the situation you're in. How much do transcription services typically cost? That's going to vary widely by your solution. So there's in Epic, there's partial dictation services, and that's an add-on for Epic. I don't know how much that costs, but it's not cheap. You also have transcription services that's like 10 cents a line or 10 cents a word. It's ridiculous. It's super expensive, and it costs a lot of people a lot of money in the hospital. I use templates, I use Epic, I use smart phrases, and I don't use transcription services, and so I don't want to have to pay for it for the other people in the hospital. And so, unfortunately, I can't really answer the specifics on that, but obviously there's going to be a wide range depending on what you use. How often do you treat patients on the weekend, and how often are you on call? So, you know, that is a really good question, because it turns out that I was going in very frequently on weekends during residency whenever I was on call. But then I came to this community, and it's just a different culture. And basically, if someone is in a situation where they can be put on steroids, stabilized, and wait till the next morning, generally they don't even call us until the next morning. So we don't treat a lot of patients on the weekend. We do sometimes, and we do when it's appropriate, but it's just not that often. I would say like once a year. It's kind of funny too, because 2 Julys ago was when I had 0 partners. It was me, and I had to cover 2 different hospitals, and I had a vacation in the middle of the month. So I had 2 locums providers here at the same time, and of course I got phone calls while I was in Colorado on vacation both weekends that I was that there was an emergency spinal cord compression, and that like never happens. And of course we didn't really have anyone on call because they were all locums people, and so that's just a funny story about, you know, you never know how it's all going to happen. But how do you tactfully keep track of compliance, provide feedback within the department? So this is a good question. Actually, again, I'm probably going to air some dirty laundry here, and I know this is going to be archived on the ACRO website, so I got to be careful how I say this, but I did have a partner that I hired. So I was the senior partner, even though this partner is quite a bit older than me and has quite a bit, you know, on paper should be senior to me, you know. But they had a formal complaint against them by one of the therapists in the department, and it was my job as the director to go over this complaint with them. That was an awkward situation, I'm not going to lie. That was a difficult thing to do, but I think that you just have to be humble about it and just say, look, you know, this is the information we were given, and we just need to figure out how to address these issues. And you know, part of it is also just a lot of empathy. So when this partner was offended by this, I tried to express my support and say, I recognize that you feel misunderstood, you feel like this is not fair, what can we do to make it better, and try and be constructive that way. So that was another MD. Now, feedback within the department to a nurse or therapist is a tricky situation because I am not employed by them and I'm not their direct supervisor. That's a challenge, and that's something where there is an advantage if you are the hiring person and you are in a private practice where you actually are the boss. But that's going, you know, out of style. There's a lot of practices now where that's just not the case. It's almost like it's, you know, unionized or something. They want HR to do all the disciplinary stuff, and physicians don't have anything to do with making those decisions, probably because a lot of physicians are tyrants is basically what it boils down to. I had a major disagreement with nurses at one point in my practice where I just wanted them to do the medication reconciliation the way that it was supposed to be done in Epic, and I tried to ask them politely for that, and they just would never do it. And one day I got into a little bit of a confrontation with them about it, and I thought I was being very rational and reasonable about it, but they were very upset about it, and they went and complained to the department supervisor, and so we had to hash it out through a third party. That's fine. They have a supervisor. I have no problem with them using their supervisor the way their supervisor is intended, and frankly, they sided with me. They said, yes, you should do the medication reconciliation the way it's supposed to be done. And if it's not, and their contention was, they hadn't been trained that way, no one does it that way, and so we said, well, there's some opportunities there within the hospital to address those things. So I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but that's the way we did that. Last question presented. What do you do in Epic and what do you do in ARIA for documentation, or do you document only in ARIA? So this is something that is particularly challenging because the two hospitals I work at have two separate systems. Luckily for me, both hospitals have Epic and both hospitals have ARIA. When I started, we used ARIA for most of the documentation. All the clinic notes were in ARIA. So we've made a decision that well, this gets a little bit complicated. So one of the hospitals I practice at is a part of a large integrated health system that covers most of the state. And so we're providing professional services on contract, but the hospital itself is a part of this other system that is like the Borg. It's huge, it is very bureaucratic, and you can never actually get anything changed because people don't want to do things the way you want to do them. And so at that hospital, most of the radiation oncology departments in that system use ARIA for all of their documentation. We've decided to use Epic for our documentation because then it's accessible. Well, all of the clinical documentation that you want to have accessible to other providers is done in Epic, and then the radiation-specific documentation is done in ARIA. So the physics notes, the dose notes, a lot of those things, those are all in ARIA. But then the completion note, the consultation note, and the follow-up notes are all done in Epic because then they can be viewed by the referring providers as just part of the notes tab. And so that's how we decided to set that up. All right, got a couple more questions. Thank you very much. Do you keep a patient list? How do you keep track of little things? That's something that is very challenging, and I think that people don't necessarily do it the same way. I rely a lot on my support staff to keep track of patients for me. I make sure that before a patient leaves the department, we have them scheduled for their follow-up. And then if they miss that follow-up, we call immediately and send a letter to have them reschedule that. And sometimes patients are lost to follow-up when they don't do those things. You got to decide how much of that you can tolerate, and if you're going to keep a running list for yourself and you're going to chase them down repeatedly even when they are non-compliant or not. And so I have partners who have a running spreadsheet where they keep track of these things and they go back over it and are very detail-oriented. I'm more of a live and let live kind of a guy. I figure I've done my due diligence by calling and asking them to reschedule their appointment, and they have to take some ownership for keeping their appointments and coming back. And I make it very clear when I do my follow-ups that they are intended to follow for the rest of their life, and that's important, that they're not cured, that they are only controlled, and we need to make sure that we follow that. And so it's partly rhetorical. The way that you explain it to people helps to emphasize to them that they need to keep coming back. So I don't know if that's actually answering the question that you have, but there you go. Thanks again, and I guess that's all the questions, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you again, Dr. Hopkins. And once again, this has been approaching and managing key issues of a freestanding private practice. If any of you have any more questions, feel free to send me an email at jleckie@acro.org. And make sure to complete the survey that I send around after this webinar has been completed. And if any of you are interested in meeting Dr. Hopkins or other ACRO radiation oncologists, make sure to come to the annual meeting March 9th through the 11th at the Hilton Orlando Lake Buena Vista in Orlando, Florida. Thank you very much and have a great night.